In this video, we're going to see the legendary Bobby Fischer put on the defensive and how he takes care of that situation, as well as some exemplary endgame play. Hey guys, this is a game between Carlos Guimard, who was a Argentine chess grandmaster, and Bobby Fischer, of course, who was world champion between 1972 and 1975, and perhaps one of the greatest chess players ever. I wanted to, well, Bobby Fischer is one of my favorite players, so I'm really looking forward to sharing a few of his games with you on this channel. And I came across this one as I was studying the other day, and I thought this would be a great one to start with. So this was played in Buenos Aires in 1960, so before Bobby Fischer became a world champion. Started off with d4, and Bobby Fischer replied with knight to f6. Knight to f3 was played, g6, and bishop to g5. And this is the Torre Attack. It's not one of the mainstream lines, but it is kind of a little bit of an offbeat thing that's seen a lot in club play, and actually a few other strong players, such as world champions Boris Spassky and Tigran Petrosian, also included it in their repertoire. So definitely not something that is bad by any stretch of the imagination. Bishop to g7. Fischer is adopting a King's Indian setup, which was one of his favorite defenses against the queen pawn openings until he adopted the Grunfeld a little later in his career. Knight b to d2, d6, and e4. And then black plays h6. And in the book where I read this in, which is Irving Chernev's 12, actually I have the book right here, so I can show that to you. 12 great chess players and their best games. He comments that this was an unusual move, which bishop takes f6. And one thing to remember with Bobby Fischer, not only was he incredibly talented, he was also one of the most voracious studiers of the opening. His knowledge of the opening was very high, and of course his opponents knew this, so this might have been Guimard's way of sidestepping any of Fischer's preparation on this opening. So bishop takes f6, bishop to b5 check, c6, bishop to d3, and now we're going to see this placement of the bishop here. We're going to see the importance of this coming down this diagonal a little later in the game. Castles, and now excellent move by white e5. Okay, and typically against this type of opening, and with the King's Indian in general, black wants to counterattack with e5 to put a little bit of a stake in the center, but black allowed this, e5, and after bishop to g7, he plays queen to e2. So he's starting to build up pressure. He's going to move this queen here and start to attack down the king side. And black replies with c5. So the idea here is that black's bishop wants to, the whole point behind the king, one of the points behind the King's Indian is that the bishop has a lot of scope down this diagonal. So black wants to counterattack in the center, and here he's undermining white's center with this c5 move. Okay, well, white continues on, h4, and here he is striking on his own on the king side here. C takes d4 and h5. So we could see that actually in this, not in the classical King's Indian, but in this type of defense where black is fianchettoed, white will often attack down the h file, and with this battery here, sometimes in combination with if the dark square bishop was still on, attacking and trying to trade this black's dark square bishop. Okay, well, of course it would be a mistake to take on h5 because rook takes h5, and now white's attack is well underway as white has the open h file. So black plays g5 instead. And white continues here. Queen to e4, of course, threatening checkmate on h7. And now black plays f5. Okay, pretty much the one of the only moves to try to stop this. And we're going to see a sequence here that Fischer probably calculated in order to stop or at least slow down white's attacking chances. So in this game, I wanted to show you this game too because black is actually on the defensive. So we're going to see how he stays active and counterattacks from his position on the defensive. So white from here plays e takes f6 en passant, and here black plays rook takes f6. And I want to show you, this is the only move in the position. I'm going to show you a few alternatives here. And of course, if he takes with the bishop, then we just have a mate in 2 with queen to g6 check, king to h8, and queen h7 mate. Okay, and if he takes with the pawn, we have queen to h7 check, king to f6, bishop to g6 check, and the king can go either to e6 or to e7. So let's take a look here. If king to e7, then queen takes g7 check, king to e6, and knight takes d4 check. And I think it's fairly safe to say that black would be in trouble. And then if we go back, if he goes to e6, knight takes d4 check, king to d7, and then bishop to f5 check, and followed up at some point by queen takes g7. And again, black is in a lot of trouble here. So we can see that rook takes f6 is the only move. Okay, after rook takes f6, white plays another excellent attacking move. Knight takes g5. And of course, it's important to note here that black cannot take this pawn, or this knight, and let's take a look at why. After h takes g5, we have queen to h7 check, and after king to f7, then white has h6. So this attack would be very dangerous for black, as we can see. And if we just go back after queen takes f7 check, if the king goes to f8, then we could still play h6. And we can see here that white will be getting back his material as well as continuing on with the attack. So let's see what other moves black can try instead of taking the knight. Well, he can try developing other pieces, such as knight to c6. The problem with this is that white now has access to this diagonal and can come in with bishop to c4 check. So we can see that that's, you can see all of these squares around black's king are very vulnerable. So very dangerous. And if he tries to play something like bishop to f5, counterattacking here, well, he's leaving some weaknesses. Queen takes b7, and black could develop with knight to d7, but now he's losing some material as well in this variation. So we can see that these options are not great, and what Fischer did was the best move, I think, and he played d5. Okay, and here he is telling this, basically making white, giving him a decision. So one of the things in chess that actually this is very illustrative of is sometimes forcing moves are not always the best moves, but sometimes you want to, it helps you to calculate further what's going on, because you could, even if it forces white to make a decent move, at least you can look further and see what you can do from there. And so I think that's kind of behind Fischer's method. But also, very immediately, it also blocks off this diagonal, so white's light square bishop can't go to c4 to attack the king either. Okay, so after d5, queen to h7 check, king to f8, and then white, again, bringing more attackers into the attack with castle's queenside. And it's difficult to see perhaps how um, black is, or how black is going to get out of this. But Fischer, again, I think probably had a lot of this figured out. Of course, being who he was probably able to see very far, but also um, realized that in order to combat this, he had to stay active and couldn't just defend passively. So here he develops his knight to c6, and then white plays a move here, f4. Now, the idea behind this is a couple. He's covering this e5 squares because this knight would love to hop onto e5 and attack this bishop, as well as maybe coming back here to defend g6 if necessary. And also, he's offering this pawn. Now, of course, Fischer's not going to take it. If he did take it, then basically white gets his rook coming down the f-file. So this would be very bad. And of course, Fischer didn't do this. So let's go back. Before we move on to the rest of the game, I wanted to just jump back to this position before knight to b4 and see, is there anything that white could have done? Because in reality, white looks like he's doing very well here. In fact, it looks like he might be winning. And could white have done anything to avoid what we're talking about? And it's kind of difficult here. This is one of those games, and you see annotators write this like, I'm not sure where white went wrong, and this is kind of like that. I analyzed this line a little bit where he plays a3 instead of f4. Now, if knight to e5, which f4 was trying to prevent, we actually can transpose back to the game with f4, and then knight takes d3 check, and then queen takes d3, and this is exactly the same position as we have in the game. But black actually has another option here if a3 is played that is very active as well and very good, and that is queen to d6. Okay, so now this queen gets off of the back rank, which we'll look at later variations, could be very useful, but it's also very, it can go to f4, it can help defend along this third rank, and so it's a very active move here. Let me give you a couple moves here. Knight g to f3, just getting out of the way here, and that's one of the ideas too behind queen to d6 is that now we can take on g5 because now this rook and queen are covering the h6 square, and after e5 we can see how imposing we're threatening this fork here, and we can see how imposing these central pawns are. So this would be very good for black, and this is just one variation that I looked at it, the logical alternative to f4 that white played. But I really think f4 was a good move as well. So it's one of those things where very subtle differences that make a difference in the game. And going back to the game, it's not that black is actually losing at this point, but definitely I think the initiative has swung back in black's favor. So let's see what happens next. Okay, so going back to where we left off, after h takes g5, we have here h6. Okay, and there's two options for black, either to take back with the rook and to take back with the bishop. In the game, he takes back with the bishop, but let's take a look at what happens if he takes with the rook. Rook takes h6, and the reason why this might seem logical is that black is actually up a piece right now, so we might want to avoid any troubles there. Rook takes h6, bishop takes h6, and now queen to h7 will now threatening to grab this piece back, and then after queen to d6, protecting this piece, it actually looks okay for black, pretty good for black here. And I think, before I talk too much about that, let's look at here. If he tried to retreat here at bishop to g7, then f takes g5, and then we see threats here with this rook coming in here on f1, bearing down on the king. But after queen to d6 in this variation, black is up a piece, but white still has a lot of play here. You know, he's going to be threatening this bishop, and this queen is just very dangerously close to the king with this f-file about to open up. And I think it's a more complicated position. And here I think Fischer chose the other route, which we're going to get into in the game, because even though he doesn't have any problems with complications, he already saw a position he could win further down the line with the other alternative. And that's something in our games too. Sometimes we might have a choice between an option that looks enticing, maybe some type of sacrifice that can give us a brilliant combination, and then maybe like a safer move that isn't as exciting, but one that we know will give us a good game. And sometimes, depending on our mood and depending on our energy and perhaps the time on the clock, tournament situation, we might choose one over the other. So I think, well, chess is a game about making decisions. So here we see that Fischer takes a certain route. And so let's take a look at that. So if we go back to the game, Fischer actually played bishop takes h6. Okay? And after f takes g5, we can see that this, we can see here that there is a fork, and Fischer ignores it. He plays bishop to f5 here, and basically counting on the specific combination. So let's see what happens. Rook takes h6, and then bishop takes d3. And again, now Fischer didn't miss anything here. He knows what's about to happen. Rook to h8 check, king to g7. By the way, let's just go back real quick. If g takes f6, king to f7, and c takes d3, white just doesn't have enough for the queen. So he needs to do what he did in the game. Rook to h8 check, king to g7, rook takes d8. And now, tell me what you would play next. Why don't you pause it for a moment and tell me what you would play here, because we have these two pieces that are being attacked. Hope you had a chance to take a look at that. From here, Fischer plays a beautiful move, rook to c6, right out of our tactics manual, pinning this pawn and threatening a check here. Okay, and let's just take a look here. If he were to take, of course, rook takes d8, and then we get the intermediate move, g takes f6 check, king takes f6, c takes d3, and white would be winning. But after rook to c6, rook takes a8, we have a nice little combination. Rook takes c2 check, king to b1, and he could play rook to c8 check to win back the rook. But again, he wants to simplify into a position that he knows he can do well in. And this, in case you've had this thought, it's very similar to something that like Capablanca would do. Okay, rook to d takes d2 check. Okay, and to avoid losing the rook, he goes back. White goes back to c1, and then we have a little windmill tactic again. Rook to c2 check, king to b1, rook to c8 check. Okay, rook takes d3, taking the piece that's checking the king, and then rook takes a8. And so let's pause here and just take a moment to assess the position. When we take a look at this position, and maybe we'll make one more move here just to show what would happen next. There's a few things going on here. First, we can see the material's even, but the differences here are in black's favor. Okay, his central pawns here are connected. Okay, and they are pass pawns because they cannot be stopped by any of white's pawns. And white also has a couple pass pawns, but they're on the same file. They're doubled, and they're going to turn into targets for black. And with regard to king, they're about the same, but black is slightly more advanced and slightly into the game a little faster. So it might not be a huge edge, but definitely I think we can say that black has a little bit of the better of it. And this is probably the position that Fischer had in mind way back when he decided to allow, when he took with bishop takes h6. So again, showing his foresight here. And we're going to see how Rook and pawn endgames are very common, whether you're a grandmaster, a world champion, or like ourselves, amateurs and club players. We're just trying to enjoy the game. So his treatment of it is very instructive. So let's see what Fischer does. Well, he protects this pawn first, rook to d8. Um, he could also play, something like e6, but again, he's trying to activate this rook. Having your rook in the endgame, active in the endgame, is very important, as we've seen in other videos. Okay, well, white brings his king into the action, king to c2, and now black attacks this pawn here. Rook to f4. Pretty much going to give up on this pawn because black wants to try to counterattack and get his own rook active. King takes g5, rook to f7. And now an important move here because he's kind of skewering all these pawns. And we've seen in Capablanca's games, this rook on the 7th rank in the endgame can be very dangerous. However, here, rook to d8 covers the 7th rank very nicely. King to d3. And now king to g6. So now we're evicting this rook from the 7th rank. Rook to f8. And Fischer makes another great move here. Rook to g7. So he's making white make a choice between retreating his rook and maybe getting into a more defensive position or trying to have a more active position. And white here chooses to be a little more active. But as we'll see, this rook kind of gets cut out of play for a few moves, and it's very very decisive. Okay, b6 to protect the a pawn. King to d4. Okay, and here's the key now. Black doesn't have to rush here in terms of defending this pawn because it's already protected. He just brings his king in. Covers the e5 square, so white's king cannot make any further progress into black's position. Rook to f8 check, and again, black has a plan here. King to e6, rook to g8, and king to d6. So when this was the plan, to centralize this king. g4, okay, white makes a logical move, advancing his own pass pawn, and e5 check. Okay, we can see here the quality of black's play here. When he's making very, very good moves, but he's doing it with tempo, so white, it's very difficult for white to make progress. King to d3, and now black makes an excellent move, and this will be another place too. If you want to pause it, I'll just give you a moment. Okay. Black plays rook to h7. Again, one of the key points here in rook and pawn endgames is to centralize the king and to make these rooks as active as possible. And we can see here now this rook's going to be getting behind this pawn. It's going to be attacking the king here, pushing it back. And you can see here that it's much better than something like rook to f7 because now this king would get a little bit closer. Okay, so rook to h7, excellent move. g5, we're trying to get that pawn a little further. King to e6. Okay. By the way, something like rook to h3 check would work also. King to e2, king to e6. Again, we get a similar position to what we got in the game. But let's go back. g6. Rook to h3. Notice that the white king has to go back to c2. Rook to h2 check. And here I think he also could have just gone to g3. But after rook to h2 check, king to b3. Now the point here I think is and we'll see it in a few moves, he is pushing white, forcing it to protect these pawns. If obviously if he moves up here, for example, then black advances his own pawn with check, and if it has to stay in contact, otherwise he's going to lose the b pawn here. So going back to the game, king to b3, now rook to g2, getting behind this pawn, g7, and now king to f6. King to f7 would work, but king to f6 is slightly better, staying in contact with his own pawn. Rook to d8, now threatening to promote this pawn. Rook takes g7, and rook takes d5. And from here, the victory is fairly easy, and we'll see it. It's very Fischer, of course, plays in an excellent manner, and his next move is the best move on the board. And think about what you would play, but he plays rook to c7. And we can see here cutting off white's king. Okay, a4, trying to break up these white's or black's pawns. e4. Okay, now when I was analyzing this game, I was wondering why he didn't play something like king to f5 so that his king can escort the pawn towards promotion. I do think it would win well. I actually played out a line against the computer and did a little analysis, which I'll show you in a second. But Fischer saw that he could bring his king up in time to protect the pawn, as we'll see in the game. If the black king were further away, he would need to take time to bring the king in. But in this particular position, we'll see what he plays here. Let me just show you this line here with king to f5. Okay, white can continue on with a5, and this is actually a line that I played against the computer to illustrate this point. B takes a5. Okay, that's very important. Instead of allowing black to take here, king to a2, king to f4, just preparing to advance this pawn. Rook takes a5, and now we just keep pushing this pawn. Rook or e4, rook to a6, e3, rook to e6. Okay, and here we just keep bringing the king up to shepherd this pawn in. Rook to f6 check, king to e2, king to b1. We can see this rook here, how important it is to cut the king off. King to e1, and here this is a good way. You need to be able to extricate the king here. The key here is to promote this pawn. We have to get off of the e file, but white's rook will be waiting for us to check, so we need to prepare for that. Rook to e6, e2, rook to e5. Here he's just waiting on this e file to deliver checks. And here's the key move here in this endgame is rook to f7, because now we give black a file to go on. Rook to h5, king to f2, rook to h2 check, and now king to f1. And the computer here played king to a2, but if we were to check again, now we simply play this, and then here, and then we move back here with king to f2, and now white is going to, black is going to promote after the rook moves. Let's say rook moves to h1, and then we will promote, and that will be winning. So anyways, so that let's go back to the game. Here, king to f5 also wins, but I think Fischer's method is maybe a little more elegant, a little cleaner than what I just showed you. He played e4, and rook to h5, again with this idea of being able to deliver checks as well as getting in front of the pawn. And e3, rook to h3, and now rook to e7, getting behind the passed pawn. Rook to h1, okay, so now we're just going to try to get in front of it. e2, rook to e1, and now here's the key, is that you see it takes 3 squares, 3 moves for black's king to reach this pawn, and it also takes 3 moves for the white king, and this is why Fischer was able to play this way. King to f5, king to c3, king to f4, king to d2, king to f3. Now some last-ditch efforts by white, rook to h1, but simply rook to d7 check. Okay, and of course he can't play king to e1 because of rook to d1 mate. So he plays this king to c2, and after king to g2, white resigned because he's going to be promoting in a couple moves, as we saw in that other variation that I showed you. So this was a nice game by Fischer, so I just want to cover a couple of the what I found to be the most instructive points of the game. And the first one here is around move 15, and this is where white is under, or black is under attack from white, and white starts to fight back here in the center with d5. Okay, so we see here after queen to h7 check, king to f8, castles, we see here that black now starts to bring in his own forces, and so that he's going to be able to counterattack and fight back. The second point that I found very instructive was this position here, where actually if we go back a couple moves, this position here where black had a choice between taking with the rook and taking with the bishop. And at least in my analysis, it looked like both moves were pretty good for black. But the key point here is that Fischer made his assessment based on what he saw in the future. And with the move he played, which was bishop takes h6, even though well, his continuation, of course, was fairly complicated and very tactical, he saw a position where he would have a winning rook and pawn endgame. And that suited him very well. And maybe another player, or maybe Fischer in a different situation, might have tried something, might have taken with the rook and got into that other complicated line that we discussed during the game. And then the final point I wanted to summarize here at the end was just the understanding of those basic principles with these rook and pawn endgames, and those being that we need to have an active centralized king, a very active and a very active rook in these endgames, and also I guess in endgames in general, that we need to be patient and to kind of have a plan. And so studying these endgames, rook and pawn endgames are very, very common. So I would definitely recommend studying those. Capablanca, Rubinstein were experts in it, but as you can see here, Fischer obviously no slouch in the endgame as well. So I'm not going to play through this whole position. You could replay it if you want, but this game in particular was very exemplary in his treatment of the rook and pawn endgames. Thank you for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please press the like button and subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. Bobby Fischer was one of my favorite players, and we will definitely be seeing more of his games on this channel. If you have a favorite game of his, let me know in the comments. Until next time, I hope you have a great day, and good luck with your chess.